It's great to be reading for AQR. It's a magazine I've always loved and respected. Thanks for having me. I'm going to read a story called Common Area. It has an epigraph by Robert Stone from A Flag for Sunrise. He felt as though he were choosing one dream from among many. There were birds in all of them. The air traffic controller had always admired St. Francis of Assisi's uncomplicated rapport with small birds and animals. On the walk back from the bar, he decided to visit the parrots. These self-possessed birds held their tongues by night and woke at dawn to startle guests at the bed and breakfast with garbled approximations of unremarkable daily sounds. Now, in the parlor upstairs, he lifted the cover from one of the hulking cages. It was an Afghan with radial powder blue piping that he suspected the owner herself had knitted. He liked the owner. She wore clothes intended for a much younger woman. He admired that. She served breakfasts of tarts and a variety of overly sweet things, then followed these up with dessert. She looked fit in jeans. The parrot beneath raised its head groggily. This would be Rita. The owner had told them the night before that her son was the only other person alive who could touch this bird. For years, they'd had a special relationship, her son and Rita. The air traffic controller had flashed to images of St. Francis of Assisi, thin-faced, one bony hand extended to the sparrows, stigma clearly visible. Cage cover in hand, he became aware of his own swaying, churned by the waves of what was possible. Lodging at the bed and breakfast was his wife's idea. He left that kind of thinking to her. It beat Hampton in, but he resented the forced conversation with other guests in the morning, and he avoided the common area. The walls were thin. The first night, lying in the narrow bed next to his wife, he'd worried about the owner's son. He'd heard the floorboards outside the room snap, then fall silent. And he imagined he could feel the feathery edge of the man's zone of influence through the wall. This made him nervous about performing the connubial intimacies incumbent upon all married men. The owner's son drank, that was clear. He'd emerged from half-darkened rooms wearing a soiled t-shirt. Perhaps this is a man of inconsistent moral convictions. The air traffic controller lifted the latch to open the cage and slid the sleeve of his jacket up past his elbow. According to the owner, parrots like these routinely lived beyond 100 years. Rita was the younger bird, with a long life ahead of her. The air traffic controller was already 51. He ate 30-minute steel-cut oatmeal in the morning and exercised aerobically. He had that kind of patience. Into the cage went his fist, slowly. He was trespassing. Well within his zone of concern now, Rita fidgeted. They demonstrated wisdom, these birds. People wrote them into their wills. During the day, Rita imitated a landline telephone and the end of recess bell from the grammar school next door. She issued what sounded like spoken English words. The air traffic controller knew better. What made a word wasn't only the sound. The night before, the owner had warned him not to insert his finger into the cage. Rita's beak appeared to be made of calcium, formed through a process of accretion, like the curve of a nautilus shell. Last night, the air traffic controller had stood in this same spot, bourbon fuzzy, and all at once he'd realized the owner didn't trust him. Her words, her glances, her whole manner seemed to call into existence a world of recrimination to swallow him whole. She was a tiny woman with a handsome face and clear eyes, sassy eyes. With them, she'd seen something in the air traffic controller, some flaw in his soul that might lead to cruelty. But the air traffic controller wasn't cruel. He was competent. He kept thousands of people airborne and alive. Rita understood. They had their own connection. The air traffic controller commuted 45 minutes each way to work, rode the elevator to the 11th floor of a building with small windows in suburban Tampa, not far from a decommissioned section of the Air Force Base. Between shifts, he read widely: science, meteorology, military history. He absorbed language courses on various digital media. Noons, he lunched at Subway with men his age who piloted remote-operated drones into enemy airspace on the other side of the planet. He'd played squash with one of them, only to decide against allowing the friendship to blossom after imagining the man's interior life. The air traffic controller's own zone of operation, the airspace he officially presided over, started small at ground level. There it stretched just 50 miles across, but ascended in expanding radii to form an inverted wedding cake. He used this analogy at breakfast across from other husbands whom he secretly pitied for their positions as postal clerks or sales associates or small business owners, and his wife rolled her eyes. "Rita," he said, "what's the word on the street?" In slow motion, the bird shifted her prehistoric grip along a wooden dowel, edging away from him. She cocked her head. She was dripping with character. When the air traffic controller started to bob in place, Rita bobbed as well. "Get down," he whispered. "Show me what you got." Farther into the cage, he piloted his fist. She stopped bobbing and issued a low-pitched rumbling noise akin to human gargling. Whoa. Shoulders hunched, he listened for stirrings in the house. Nothing. Rita leaned forward, then crept back, teasing him. He slipped his cell phone from his jeans. The night before, he'd been videotaping Rita through the bars of her cage when the owner appeared. Even at work, he had a lot of time on his hands, in between brief shifts. He managed a huge portion of Caribbean airspace. Millions benefited, people he could only envision in dreams, each at the center of a circle, the overlapping edges bluish green. He called up the video of Rita and faced the phone toward her like a mirror she might peer into. Perched at the threshold of the cage, she need only lean forward to stroke the smooth surface of the phone with her calcified carapace of a beak. She seemed bored. The video ended. The air traffic controller wiped the phone on his jeans and put it away and offered Rita his wrist. "It's your call," he said. She angled an eye at him, at his wrist, then inched onto the bump of it, her talons needling his skin. "I'm not cruel, Rita," he said. "I'm patient." Rita seemed to understand. He focused. He tried to sensitize himself to her zone, which he imagined extending a few inches from the center of her being, where whatever it was that looked out through her eyes resided. From there, if it existed, it would radiate out beyond her downy outline into the realm of worldly contingencies. But he saw nothing like that. Rita lowered her iridescent head as though inviting him to caress the soft blue-green region above her beak, like a lover. But he was cautious. The owner had done exactly this the night before, even as she'd issued warnings. And when he tried it now, Rita bobbed left, then right, a slow motion dodge, like something from the age of silent film. Years from now, this bird, this very Rita, would remember the air traffic controller. He'd be dead. All the people he'd kept safe would be dead, not Rita. He offered up the bony fulcrum of his knuckle, against which she might scratch herself. He wasn't going to rush her. She could come to him. But she must have grown confused despite her limitless wisdom, because she raised her beak in a swift, thoroughly natural motion, clamped onto the fatty bulge below his knuckle, and opened a beak-shaped gash. She hopped to the room's only wingback chair to look back at him. He whistled an insuck, cupped his hand, and turned toward the hallway light. "Damn, girlfriend." There was a triangular flap, a little trap door of flesh and pulp, like the incurled isosceles he'd punched into cans of high C as a child. There was no pain yet. The blood welled thick and viscous, spilling into his other palm, then over to drip and bead on the oriental rug's elaborate patterns. At first, he had the presence of mind not to move. He resisted the airy panic of two eager pourers of champagne, surprised by the volume of bubbly. He took his finger in his mouth and tongued the wound. It tasted the way licking the nodes of a 9-volt battery felt, tangy. Rita's entire manner suggested a profound lack of concern. Her own dry tongue appeared for a moment. With it, she seemed to lick her lips. But parents didn't have Parrots didn't have lips. They had beaks. Hers was limned with red. Stiffly, the air traffic controller stepped into the lavatory off the parlor and with his elbow tripped the light switch. He stood over an antique porcelain sink all spidered with brownish cracks and watched it spot with red. With the meat of his good hand, he twisted the cold water on and let the clean stream rinse the blood from his finger in curled strings. He pulled a hand towel from a silver loop and fashioned a bandage that wound around and around to end in a fat cotton mitt that he held up for inspection. He felt calm, but this didn't surprise him. Whatever his own circle touched, even for a moment, it left calmer, more itself. In the parlor, Rita clung to the converging bars at the crown of her cage. She scratched her head with a free claw. She lifted a wing to dislodge parasites with her enormous beak. The air traffic controller listened again for stirring in the house. He unraveled the bandage, and the gore surged like fresh jewelry. He found a clean towel and tightly rewrapped the wounded finger. I see what you mean, Rita, he said to himself. I hear you. Back in the parlor, he watched the bird maneuver with the steadying grip of her beak into the cage. What did the taste of human flesh do to a parrot? Enough said. He snapped the door shut, lifted the cage from its hook, set it on the rug to drape the knit cover. With his good hand, his boots avoiding the blood splatter on the rug, he carried the cage out into the hallway's polished hardwood, down the stairs, then into the wider space of what the owner called the common area. The wound in his fingers seemed fully awake now. It seemed to be transmitting in a code he'd forgotten along with telegraph wires that loped to the farthest outposts of what he was. Near the threshold to the den, he felt a ripple, a fluctuation he associated with the intersection of zones. Then he saw, slumped on a couch, the owner's son, whose overcoat had ridden up to his waist, his chin resting in a pool of his own neck flesh. Which one you got there, champ? A puffy man. He didn't take up a lot of space. He was younger than the air traffic controller by 15 years. They looked like contemporaries. The air traffic controller raised the cage and cleared his voice. Rita, I think. You mean Kiwi? The owner's son sat up. No, it's Rita. I don't know where you came up with Rita. There's Kiwi and Wink. He reached for a square, unlabeled bottle at a side table. His wet eyes on the air traffic controller. He drew a slow, significant draft. She nip you? The air traffic controller lifted the mid of his fist. Sweet Jesus. The owner's son stood, approached, slowed, smiled. Did you stop up on the way home? There was mockery in his voice. We haven't been formally introduced. Where are you taking my bird? The man seemed to remember the bottle in his hand. He offered it up to the air traffic controller, whose own hands were full. Then he crouched carefully to lift the cover. You got Kiwi here. She's not partial to this cover. Too hot. Not enough air gets in. She don't like it. That's your bird. The air traffic controller tried to smile. The one they're both my birds, our birds, me and my mother's. You have something with Rita, a certain special something between you. Let's get some air. A rapport. He thought he could see it now, the uneven frontier of the man's zone, shifting, glimmering. The owner's son stood blinking at him. Put the cage down. I wouldn't hurt Rita. It's Kiwi. Put the cage down. The air traffic controller glanced at his bandaged hand, thinking he might see his wounded finger charged and burning through the fabric of the towel, its own species of light leaking out. I apologize. I left a little blood on the rug up there. Up where? In the parlor, on the rug. You've had a few. You stopped off. Neither of them had noticed the owner. Now it was too late. She stood in the hall in a tartan robe, her hair up, her arms crossed, her thin white shins below. Oop, said the son. She looked from one man to the other and back. What I tell you, she said finally to the air traffic controller. There was power in her eyes. You stuck your finger in the cage. Not the whole story, but the air traffic controller wasn't going to get into it all. The complicated world. I did, he said. How bad she get you? She asked. A granny and a looker all in one. A seer into his uncluttered soul. Then, where are you taking my bird? The owner's son fussed with a boxy lump in his t-shirt pocket. Him and I were going out for a smoke, but the owner continued to glare at the air traffic controller, even after he'd set the cage down between them. Her eyes were unbearable. People were dying on the other side of the world, he wanted to say, flickering out, failing. Here we were bickering over birds in Florida. So be it, he wanted to say, lesson learned. He'd never touch another parrot in his life. Decades hence, in homes not yet built by people not yet born, Reader would grow strong on the memory of his blood. He'd live on in that way. The owner stepped forward. The air traffic controller edged back, as though to stay just outside her zone of significance. But her zone of significance was as undeniable as it was vast, and by now he knew its edges extended well beyond the X-ray frame of the great house. Thank you.